Gun violence, a complex problem that must be solved. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Your Health, Your Choice. I'm Dr. David. And again, joining us is Shari Kulanu, who is both the executive producer of this show as well as my sister. Hi, Shari.
Hi, David.
So we have been in the midst of talking about everything that's been going on with gun violence, mass shootings, massacres, and we've already presented statistics to you. We have presented information, and we've had a conversation about is this is a gun problem or a people problem or both. And today we are going to be talking about possible solutions. We recognize that there's not going to be a quick stopping of gun violence, and we realize that some things can be changed quicker and some things can take longer, but this is going to be a generational change type of thing if we want to really make a difference. I wish I had an ability to save all the children from never having a gun violent episode ever again in our country. We know that that's probably not going to happen, but there are clear measures that seem to work that we want to talk about. And also, there's just no way we can discuss everything in this episode as well. And there's going to be more information that's going to be coming out. We are looking to do a Ask Dr. David video about ways to specifically be keeping children more safe in their schools, ways that families can be talking to their children about pardon me, about gun violence, etc. Um, but we're really wanting to look at things that both we can do as a society, but also what kind of laws can be written, can be changed that can potentially help this out. So, Shari, I know that right now that there is some apparently meaningful action happening up in the Senate right now, as ways of in a bipartisan fashion that certainly is not going to give everybody what they want, what everybody wants, but may be a move forward. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, of course, as most people watching this show know, we've been in a lot of gridlock, not only on this issue, but on lots of a lot of bipartisan divide, not really being able to get anything done. So it's kind of interesting now. What's happening is that the leaders of both the Republican and Democratic parties have put forth representatives to kind of try to see if they can come to some type of meaningful legislation that will at least start to move this forward in the right direction. Now, we should note that this has happened many times before. After many major gun tragedies, this happens. But there does seem to be something a little bit different right now, which is that um, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, was quoted recently, interestingly enough, as saying that the template of the Florida gun law that was passed in 2018 after the tragedy at Parkland at Marjorie Douglas High School. And what he said recently is that the template for Florida is actually a good one, because it makes some significant improvements in mental health investment, some school safety money, some modest but impactful changes in gun law. And that's the kind of package that they're trying to put together right now. And that's the kind of package that he thinks can pass the Senate. So, as most people know, one of the main things that needs to happen in order to move this forward is that it needs to be such that Republican senators and people in the House can get behind this bill, that they feel that they're representing their constituents and other people. And so, the Florida law that was passed in 2018 was actually passed by now Senator Rick Scott of Florida, who then was Governor Rick Scott of Florida, and it was also passed by a legislature controlled by Republicans. So the hope is that by using the Florida law as sort of a basis, that it will become more palatable and more likely that Republicans will also get on board with this, since it was initially their legislation at the state level. One thing I'll say about it is that,
Yeah, and
yeah,
one of
God,
well, I was going to just say that, I know that one of the goals and that they actually think that they may be able to get even up to 70 senators in agreement with this. And, one would certainly think that the types of, and we're going to discuss it a little further, but again, you would certainly hope that people such as Rick Scott, who signed the law into existence in the first place, would definitely get behind something like this. But I mean, let's face it, how often do we see something that is in a bipartisan nature? It's very, very rare.
right.
So anything that we could
Yep.
do, I think that's obviously a step forward for our country.
Yeah, and so absolutely, and we still have a long way to go. Nothing moves very fast up there, but one of the things I wanted to point out too is that federal law is a floor; it's not a ceiling. What that means is if the federal government passes certain laws, states generally have the right to have those be the minimum standards that they have to meet, but they can go above and beyond it. So an example would be right now the federal government is 21 for drinking. It's the general age that's required. If a state decided to move it to 25, they theoretically could. It hasn't happened anywhere, but so that just gives you an example of how states can go above and beyond what the federal government does. Now, the tricky thing, though, is that when it comes to gun laws, this has not always been successful. The courts have sort of deferred a lot to the Second Amendment and have sort of struck down a lot of state laws when they've tried to get more strict. And actually, there's a big case before the Supreme Court right now in the state of New York, and that basically is being contested. The New York state laws as being too stringent is what the argument is. And then the last thing that I want to say is just because a law is passed by Congress, then in order for it to get implemented, it gets pushed back over usually to the executive branch, one of the departments of the executive branch, such as tobacco, firearms, and then it will be up for that administrative branch to do public hearings and come up with regulations. So, this isn't going to be as quick of a process as we would like to be able to snap our fingers, but again, it's really great that there's actually some movement happening here. So, that having been said, I want to sort of move into talking about some solutions, right? Again, in parts 1 and 2 of this series, we did a lot of diving around into statistics, and one of the things we also said is that the majority of gun deaths or suicide, mass shootings are actually about 1%, less than 1%, and so we want to make sure that when we're looking at gun violence and solutions to gun violence, that we're taking a broad approach to it. So, David, talk first about one of the things that is common in the Florida law that is being looked at right now up at the Senate about the possibility of raising the age for certain firearms.
Yeah. So in Florida, well, it's interesting. One cannot purchase beer and alcohol until age 21. And in Florida, one can, well, actually, federally, one cannot purchase a handgun until age 21. Yet long guns, rifles, shotguns can be purchased at 18. And as we saw with the AR-15s that were used in some of the most recent shootings, both of these were done by people who are of 18 years of age. Now, we know that an 18-year-old versus a 21-year-old, that there is a little bit more maturity there. There may be a little bit more logic and reasoning. We know how teenagers can be. And so to say that we're already restricting it to handguns, it seems to me that that would be a very non-brainer type of thing of making all of these firearms available only to people who are over 21 years of age. I know that people have talked about how, but what about soldiers? They can be firing guns at 18 years of age. So how come they can't then? But they go through extensive training. Those privates, those sergeants aren't even allowed to have guns in their barracks. They have to, if they have their own, they have to check them in. They're not even allowed to have them there. So it's very clear that we have precedent here that waiting until an older age, and perhaps that would change something. Um, the other thing is a waiting period. Okay. And in Florida, we do have a 3-day waiting period, although there are a couple of exceptions. Um, it's interesting also in Florida, you have to wait 3 days before a marriage actually is considered legal after a person gets married. It doesn't go into effect for 3 more days. But in back to the gun part, this seems to be a cool off period. Now, at the shooting that happened in the hospital recently, we know that that person purchased a gun that afternoon and then used it a few hours later to kill the two doctors and the waiting room receptionist and the collateral damage of a patient who was in the room. So, and we know that this person was very upset because, and he had sundry reasons as to why he was upset. But who knows? Maybe during a cool off period, that maybe, like, saner brains will prevail, in terms of someone thinking through what they're about to do. So certainly it's something that Florida's doing. It's not stopping a person from getting a gun, but maybe the cool off period can bring someone to their senses. Now, also in Florida, and something that's being discussed as part of the federal bill, is prohibitions, excuse me, of individuals who are at higher risk of violence. So, Shari, tell us a little bit about about how that has been interpreted in Florida and what that may mean for us going forward.
Sure thing. And I wanted to say something actually about what you said regarding the Florida marriage law, because I actually think there's an interesting piece around this that relates. So actually, the Florida law regarding marriage is that if it's two residents of the state of Florida and you go down to the courthouse and try to get married, you have two choices. You can either sort of take this course on what marriage is supposed to be like to prepare you for it, or you can wait 3 days, right? If you are actually not a resident of the state of Florida, you just coming into the state and you go down to the courthouse, you can get married right away. So that's actually an interesting thing to look at, because sometimes this is a problem that occurs, is that there's people who come in from other states. And one of the things about the Florida law, the gun law, is it says that if it's an out of state resident purchasing a gun in the state of Florida, that they'll defer to the state from which the person is from. The problem is that that is very hard to implement, because when you have a retail gun seller, they're not necessarily having access to all of that information, because every state is different. So just wanted to point that out. Now, prohibitions on or investigating, I should say, individuals at high risk. So we discussed in our prior episode, when we're doing people or guns, what's the problem? We decided both. That's the conclusion you and I came to, at least, is that, so certain people are prone to violence, and the biggest predictor of whether somebody will be violent in the future is whether they have a history of violence in the past. And so doing background checks, doing mental health screening, especially for people who have a record of violent behavior, whether it's domestic violence, animal cruelty, armed crime. So the issue is that, like in the state of Florida, they had what are called these red flag laws, and we'll get to that a little bit more later. But basically, once it's been determined, like in the state of Florida, they'll do a hearing, right? If somebody has reasonable cause that somebody has a gun that's not supposed to have a gun, then they'll bring it to the courts. They'll do a hearing, and then there will be some way that the court, through court order, that there's a removal of the guns from the violent offenders, or otherwise restricting them from being able to purchase large capacity magazines. So there's other categories that the state of Florida has looked at, such as those who have an active restraining order on them. Um, if you've had a dishonorable discharge from the military, or if you have been involuntarily committed for mental health reasons, those are all reasons why guns can be taken away from you in the state of Florida, right? So I'm pointing it back to that again, because those are actually already in case. And as we discussed under the red flag laws and with restraining orders, the state of Florida, as of this time, has already removed approximately 8,000 times. They have removed guns from such people, right? Um, so one of the other areas, though, that we know from previous discussions, like we did in our last episode, in terms of affiliations or correlations, is white supremacy and extremist groups. Those are areas that law enforcement are trying to watch more closely to determine who is involved in those groups, where are they spending their time, what types of things are they posting, because those can sometimes give a very strong indication as to whether or not they may be an indicator of somebody who that at least the law enforcement wants to investigate further. Similarly, social media tracking is something that, in terms of investigating, that law enforcement is trying to get a little bit more involved in. As we know, in Uvalde, the shooter there had posted some pretty inflammatory stuff, pretty much saying what he was going to do to an extent, and nobody picked up on it, right? So potentially even working with social media companies to come up with algorithms to help kind of flag some of these things, so at least they can be looked into further. But also
Right.
tracking and following up.
And not just
Yeah,
not just well, not just flagging though, Shari, because there's also notification. So we know in the Uvalde situation, we know that there was the guy was put on probation for a little while, right? So what is the responsibility of these social media companies, not just to take somebody offline for a while, but they be notifying authorities that, hey, there's this kind of chatter that's going on from this particular person. We need to do something more about it.
and when you said probation, you mean probation from social media. You don't mean law enforcement or under the courts, right?
What do you mean?
Well, you had
Say
said
that
that
again.
he was under probation. Do you mean that he was under probation through law enforcement, or do you mean he was under
No,
probation from
no,
social
by the
media?
social
Okay,
media. No, by he was on the social media. They basically said, like, for a week you're
got it.
off of our channel,
Okay,
and but they wasn't. nothing else further happening.
Understood. Okay, great. Yeah, and so that's actually part of it, right? There's not only the tracking, but you got to follow up. There has to be things put into place so that areas such as mental health screenings, things that are happening in doctors' offices, things that are happening in schools, that if there is a flag, if somebody, sort of sees something, say something, right? Is that it has to go then back to the people who can actually follow up on this. And that includes things that children who are witnessing, or are victims of domestic violence, right? We know that there's more of a likelihood. So if we know that domestic violence has occurred in the house, there should be something, it would be helpful if there was something in place that those children were tracked a little bit more as they go through their growing years to see what is happening with them. Um, so I want us to move on to the next topic
And
now.
maybe more than tracked. I mean, I know but we will be talking more, but just in light with that, not just tracking,
Right.
services provided. Not, we don't want to just be tracking them. We
Yep.
want to be like following up with them. We want to
Absolutely.
have counselors who are checking in on the household situation.
Absolutely. And it's funny you should say that because the very next section that I want to move us into is for you to talk about social services. So, right. So, tracking is not good enough. Not only do we have to flag these for law enforcement, but there also has to be things in place to make sure that the people who are more prone to these things, especially children, but in general, are getting the help that they need. So, I want us to talk a little bit now about the social services and things that can be done.
Well, actually, Shari, before we get into social services, I think there are a couple of things that we need to be talking about in terms of the access to firearms, because there's things such as purchase licensing, certification, recertifications, and that's part of it. Now, Florida doesn't have any permits, right? We there's a concealed carry, but there for just for the sheer purposes of purchasing a gun, there's not. There is a background check that takes place, but there is from a licensing perspective. We talked. No military person is just given a gun and allowed to just carry it around without having being shown that they have proficiency in their skills. They are rechecked all the time. We for that matter, we do. You need to have a license to purchase alcohol, right? You do need to have for controlled substances as well, right? You can't just go ahead and get it. You need to have a doctor who is also myself certified. Not any doctor can just write for a controlled substance. You need to have specific FDA certification in order to do that. But let's face it, what other types of licenses? A driver's license. You have to show a certain basic level of proficiency before you can get a driver's license. Same thing with flying a plane. And of course, there could be limits in terms of who can drive, right? If a person has low vision, obviously they may not safely be able to drive a car. That's why when we go to get our license renewed, we always look into the thing that makes sure that we can see at a well enough clip in order to safely operate that particular vehicle. But also even just in terms of the actual training of the gun owners. Now, we don't require that, right? But maybe we can be subsidizing those types of safety classes and skills classes, right? So people know, what's the proper way to store this? What's the proper way to clean it so that it is most accurate? What's the proper way to fire it? These are things that people can learn, and you would think that before purchasing a lethal weapon that there should be some level of proficiency shown
Right.
in order to
Right.
do
I want
that.
to, yeah, and I want to jump in about that
Even in terms
for
of
a second.
oh yeah.
So, you and I were referring to a Marine Corps video that we were watching. A former Marine Corps. He's actually on active reserve now, and he was sort of giving a teaching about how, in order for him to keep weapons at home, as somebody who's in the Marine Corps on reserve, he has to requalify every year. He has to prove competency. He has to do a 2-week process where he goes and it basically his skills are evaluated. There's some mental health things that are considered at that point in time. Um, and certain things, you mentioned earlier that, privates and sergeants, even when they're in service, are not allowed to keep barracks. But basically, this Marine, former Marine, current Marine, was talking about the fact that he finds it absurd that there is no continuing licensing process. So first of all, there's no licensing process at all, but that there's no continuing licensing process. There's no certification or recertification in order to be able to have deadly weapons, basically, right? And so the idea being
Right.
that these should
Yeah.
be in place.
Right. And not just in terms of the training of the gun owners. Okay. Um, I know that at our kids' school that they do at Benjamin's High School, they did active training, active shooter training, for what to do, right? So schools and teachers, they should be regularly going through skills as to what to do if there is an active shooter on campus, right? I mean, you need to have some level of on-site, if you will, practice in order to know how to properly respond. Of course, if there's an active shooter, how many people can actually follow through? But maybe some will, oh, I saw this before. I know how to react. But also, even in terms of on the health side, having, in the military, those medics are taught how to actively assess a gun wound, how to minimize the bleeding, how to minimize get people out of the scene, get them to proper, more specific healthcare facilities. So, there needs to be training, not just, of the staff, even the resource officers, etc., on what to do with the injured person, what's the best likelihood, not letting them sit in a classroom for 40 minutes and letting them bleed out like we saw happened in Texas. So, those are things as well. And, even in terms of the gun safety itself, even education, that's such an important thing of understanding, again, what I mentioned before, the storage, the proper cleaning, etc., like that, having proper lock boxes, safe boxes available, so that people can store it properly. When I counsel families about gun safety, one of the things we talk about is having a proper safe. And some people tell me that they have a little knob to turn in. I don't know about anybody, but if there was an active potential shooter or someone breaking into my house, I don't know that I would be able to turn a knob three different ways. But so we talk about access through thumb scanners or through retinal scanners, ways that people can safely get to something if they need it, but at the same time that it's something clearly that kids cannot get into, or and so that's obviously an important thing on the safety side. Now, besides going through all that safety stuff, there is a fair question about, can we be reducing the number of firearms in circulation? And certainly the red flag laws accomplish some of that. But Shari, talk a little bit about some of the other things that could potentially do that will certainly fit within the rights, within Second Amendment rights, in terms of just reducing the sheer number that are on the
Sure.
streets.
And so this goes to what we were talking about the other day. Like everything we've been talking about so far, for the most part, has been part of the people problem, if you will, looking at high risk offenders, that kind of a thing, looking at licensing, certification, training. So this talks a little bit more about the gun side of the problem. And so, as we mentioned earlier, in the state of Florida, and what they're considering in the Senate right now is the removal of guns from people who are forbidden to have them under law, right? And that's usually done through court order with the assistance of law enforcement. There's also gun buyback programs, which have actually been incredibly successful in other countries. Now, the nice thing about gun buyback programs is if you want to keep your guns, and you don't want to have them bought back from the government, then you don't have to, right? So nobody's taking your guns in that situation. But what's interesting about it is that if somebody is selling their weapons back to the government, like in the city of Sacramento right now, for example, they're doing gas cards as part of what they're exchanging, because gas prices are so high right now. Average working class, middle class people are having a very hard time paying for transportation and gas. And so this is something that is a trade off for them. They're making a decision that I would rather have money for gas than have this, 30th weapon in my house. So some people even trade back some of their weapons and hold on to others, right? But the idea is just taking some of these out of circulation. And the other thing that you and I discussed is that people who are willing to relinquish firearms in exchange for financial gains, such as a buyback program, it is conceivable to think that those people have financial needs, right, that are not being met. And therefore, if they don't have a safe place to sell their gun back to the government, the chances are more likely that they may turn around and sell them illegally so that they can get money sort of on the black market, or the street market. So that's sort of another reason why buyback programs can be very effective. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about. Oh,
Yeah, and even legacy ones, because well, just regarding that though, because also, since that's not being, since that kind of, there would be a question even about the background checks relative to that, because if you're selling it privately, not as a
right.
licensed dealer, or you're selling it to a friend, or you're giving it to a neighbor or something like that, then there goes the background.
Exactly, right. And so then that's that. There's also looking at industry regulations. Right now, many people feel that the gun industry, which includes both manufacturers and also retail sellers, are not being adequately regulated, basically. I mean, we regulate the heck out of the automobile industry, for example, to the point where we tell them that you can't even have better gas mileage some of the times. Like, I mean, like we literally like really regulate the heck out of the auto industry. So, for example, it could be required, and this is something people have talked about, that that newly produced weapons or resold weapons have to have a safety measure, like some kind of a safety lock or something like that put into place, which is not currently required. There could also be specific limits on the sheer size of magazines up to a certain point. There could be limitations on the power of the weapon in terms of the release of the gun. And then there's also just the oversight of retail gun sellers, because we do know in some of the incidents that have been more widely publicly put forth, from large events, such as the recent killings, is that sometimes they're purchasing these weapons from retailers who are more concerned about their bottom line and making a profit and making a sale, and they're willing to kind of like skirt around some of the changes. So some of those have to be in place as well. Now, David, I know something you've had experience about when you were on the board of Brooks to Bartolo High School, and with Hillel School, was looking at some of the things that can potentially take place in terms of the buildings themselves. So we're moving on to another topic here, looking at sort of the schools themselves and some architectural and security changes that could possibly take place in schools, but also public buildings.
Yeah, certainly. So, look, and I'm going to focus more on on schools as a pediatrician, as somebody who also again was involved as a school as a member of the school board, um, that was going over these types of things. Okay, now I know that there was a lot of conversation about doors. Okay, let me clarify that. Anybody who thinks that we should have one single door in and one single door out, that doesn't make any sense. Now, could there be one door of entry that at the beginning of the day are coming in, that everybody has to go in through one door only from the outside? Yeah, both of my kids' schools have that. It doesn't mean that there's just one door in and one door out. Of course, there should be lots of doors out in case there needs to be a way out. And of course those doors should automatically lock. You know that that door did not automatically lock after the teacher did kick the rock out, in terms of that should have closed it, but it didn't happen. But of course on the way in, those doors need to be locked. But what if somebody's out on the back playground or something? There needs to be some type of electronic system that a teacher can easily, if she needs to bring a kid in because a kid fell, or broke their, or hurt something on the playground, they need to get him inside to the nurse, right? So some kind of electronic system, a buzzer system, where under proper camera supervision to make sure the person's coming in. So there are certain things that can be done to limit the number of people, or who's allowed to come into a school building. Okay. Um, yes, of course, I know people have talked about in an active shooter situation, if there was uh, some kind of blanket that a bullet can be stopped. Okay, you know what? If I guess if that was happening, I mean, again, anything, we would hope that that situation wouldn't happen in the first place. But sure, have no problem if there was some kind of storage in each classroom that kids could just kind of put over themselves in order to kind of stop getting hit from from a bullet. Hey, I mean, so there are some reasonable things that can be looked at here, that could potentially make our school building safer. Um, Now, in addition, though. Um, Social services. Okay. And so this goes beyond mental health services, which of course is part of social services, and, talking about, I know that one of the things that I ask whenever I do an assessment, that during checkups, do you feel safe in your house? Do you feel safe in your community? Whenever I do adolescent assessments, because as I mentioned, once a kid's an adolescent, we kick the parent out of the room so we can just have our own talks. Do you feel safe in your home? How is your relationship with your parents? Do you feel safe in your community? Do your friends feel safe? All of these things could be potential red flags in the terms of, hey, something needs to be done. How can I help this person? How can I invoke social services to make this person feel safe in the first place? Of course, having counseling services available for people who have depression and anxiety, or people bipolar, people with schizophrenia may have a more likely chance to go off because of the fact that of their mental health. Most people don't, but we know that that is a thing. But also the counseling of children who may be victims themselves of violence, who may have witnessed the violence, who may have had a family member. They go through a lot of stuff, and they really need to be looked after and being provided those types of services. That's like the trauma type of counseling as well. Even a little bit more of even a safe haven for potential victims, that type of thing as well. We know there are women's shelters that can serve in those purposes. But also, what kind of economic barriers might there even be to accessing those types of things, and the social barriers? So we need to make them more available. We need to make them really cost free in these situations, or at least very affordable, that a school system, that a county or whatever. And that's why we really need federal and state help. We can't just do this locally in a school system, because the finances that are necessary are really huge on that. Now, I know one of the things this kind of also leads into is arming teachers, administrators, officers, at the school. And I know that, Shar, you came across some information that was interesting relative to that. So can you
Yeah,
share with
absolutely. And
us?
I think it is a follow up to what you were saying as far as architectural stuff related to the school, right? Anything that is going to be implemented, anything that is going to be, money is going to be put in or legislated into effect, it has to be workable for the people who are in those situations. There's no point in passing a law at state government or federal government and then asking the teachers and the administrators, do you think this is a good idea? Like, they need to be engaged from the very beginning, because they are the ones who are trained educators. They're the ones who have been in that situation day in and day out for their careers. And so they need to be, discussed with. So one of the interesting things that we found is in 2013, the state of Texas started allowing for teachers to sign up to be campus marshals, which would then allow them to carry on campus. Interestingly enough, even in the state of Texas, right, which is a very gun liberal state in terms of the laws, most teachers were not interested in this. In fact, across 62 school districts, only 300 educators have signed up. Um, and this was even after gun laws were loosened, right? So teachers are not jumping at this, right? And there's various reasons why teachers have said they are not jumping at this. One, they're not trained, right? They are trained as educators. They also didn't go into this field to carry a weapon every day. They went into this field to be able to teach young impressionable minds and to help grow a generation, right? So there is a little bit of a disconnect as far as thinking that teachers are going to be jumping at this. But one of the other things that you and I were talking about originally is that some parents may not want to be in a classroom where there's a gun in the classroom. Some people may want their kids to be in a classroom only when there's a gun there. And so then how does this affect classroom placement, right? Do parents now get to choose, oh, I don't like this math teacher or that math teacher, but oh, I like this math teacher, but they don't have a gun, so I want my kid in the other classroom. And we were talking about that, but then I came across something very interesting, which is that I follow somebody on the internet. I'll put a link to him below, outside of Pensacola, Florida. And he is somebody who has done a lot of training of law enforcement and military regarding weaponry, use of weaponry, safety, in all types of different scenarios. And one of the things that he was talking about is that teachers, he said that what he said was that teachers, they can't, people can't know that the teachers have these weapons. It would have to be anonymous. Why, he said, was because if somebody is planning an a shooting situation at a school, for example, right, we'll use that as a school, but it can also happen in an office, right, in an office building, because we see these types of things happen in office buildings or medical facilities as well. If it is known that Mr. Jones in the math department is the one who has the gun, and the person is planning a shooting incident at that school, it is more likely that one of the first places they're going to go is to try to disarm Mr. Jones, right? That if they know he has the gun, especially if his gun is in a lockbox and it's going to take him a minute to get it out, that puts the teacher who has those guns in danger if it's known who they are, right? This is one of the reasons why teachers were not jumping at this. They don't want to be sort of easy targets, if you will. But more important than that, what he was talking about was that crisis active shooter situations require incredibly specialized training, right? This is not just a teacher going for a weekend course, getting a gun, and that's, off they go. And now they take their gun to school in the hope that they will pull it out and use it to shoot down a gutter if the person is there. Law enforcement and military go through extensive scenario type of bases for crisis training, right? Dealing with an active shooter is way different than knowing the basics, right? You have kids who are potentially screaming and running around. You may be in a different location and have to be worrying about getting your kids there. But just the overall intensity of the situation, again, this is something that law enforcement specifically trains for, so much to the point that the law enforcement in Texas, who were supposedly trained on this, did not enter the building for a period of time, in part because they did not feel safe, right? They were worried that they themselves may be put in harm's way. And so, what types of guns are we going to even be providing these teachers? Are they all going to have AR-15s? Because a handgun may not do enough. Are they going to have armor? But then the third point that he makes, which I also think is very interesting, is who's paying for this, right? Weapons are expensive. Ammunition is expensive. Bulletproof vests are expensive. Lock boxes are expensive. School districts can't even seem to get their budgets together in order to buy new computers for classrooms or to buy pencils and papers for classrooms. So he was saying that he believes that the idea that there would be sufficient budgets to be able to do the training, to be able to do the arming and that type of thing with the equipment is just absolutely ludicrous. So, but he was talking a little bit more about having you train law enforcement there, which is something else that we can talk about. So I want us to move on now because, we are going to run out of time a little bit, and I want us to talk a little bit about whenever we're talking about whatever these solutions are, there are certain things in our society that we know lead to the propensity for violence or that come into play when we're talking about solutions, how we're going to fund them, how we're going to implement them. I want to start, David, by having you talk about the economics and the educational piece. So when we're talking about solutions and, there are these elements that we need to consider when we're talking about where is this money going? How are we investing? Where are the areas that we're going to put this?
Yeah, um, you know, something that, of course, as a physician, poverty and the impact that it has, whether it's food knowledge, having availability to food, having shelter, having but also the despair that a impoverished community can also put things at a much more on edge. People could be much more on edge, more or feeling, hey, I have to commit this crime in order to feed my family, to pay our electrical bill, etc. And so if we're not addressing some of these underlying economic issues as to why there are certain communities that are impoverished and what can we do about them, it that could potentially be a breeding ground in those communities, if those people are not being taken care of in such a way. Now, even in terms of education and the American Psychological Association, and again, this is something that we have sourced down below, has actually said that men with less formal educational and economic opportunity will have a harder time fulfilling expectations by being successful breadwinners, etc. And that, in and of itself, can be a risk for more likely to commit gun violence. So again, this is all about the community, the economics, the how well educated people are, can they get a job, all of those types of things. And again, the more despair that there is in a community, the more likely that somebody will either act irrationally or in their mind out
Right.
of necessity. Um, so that kind of goes more into the whole aspect of funding, and we talked a little bit about there was $400 million put aside for mental health and security in the state of Florida. Now, obviously, that's a lot of money, probably not nearly enough for all of the schools that we have just here. So, but of course, if this is one, I know that this is one of the things that there is a bipartisan agreement on, that mental health as well as security can be beefed up, and but we need funding in order to do that. Hopefully, that will be addressed if hopefully we get this legislation passed. Um, there's other things. Can people, from a safety perspective, get a tax write-off for having a gun safety box, for taking a gun safety class, those types of things. And I'm allowed to write off as a as a work expense if I take a medical education class. So maybe there are some things that can be done there so we can better educate for safety, etc. For the population. But every community is going to have its own needs. This is not going to be a one size fits all solution. And that's why it is so important that we have community members involved. We cannot just have legislators who are making these decisions as to how to implement it. We can't just have bureaucrats. We can't just have, we need to have school administrators, parents, older students. They're the ones who are living through it, having their involvement, the mental health counselors, all of the above are going to be needed in order to make a
Right.
comprehensive
You know, I,
solution
yeah, I
or
wanted to say something
solutions.
about that because, some of the Parkland students, after the incident that happened at Marjorie Douglas High School, became very active in trying to shift gun violence, and a lot of people feel that they have not been adequately given a voice and in terms of legislation and that type of thing. I wanted to say something though. You were talking about economics and education, and there is a tie there, right? The But it's not just about access to guns, right? It's also about other things that lead to suicide, mental health, um, not having access to social services. Like we know that impoverished communities tend to have worse access of social services. And in the United States, people that have less formal educational opportunities or are hit harder by economic opportunities are disproportionately Black and Latino. That is just statistically known. So looking at those communities also specifically is something that needs to be considered. And this is one last thing I wanted to say when we were talking about arming teachers at schools or having armed marshals at schools, is we would be delinquent, right? If as people having a conversation on this issue, if we did not at least talk about racial bias issues when it comes to having guns in schools. Because one of the things is we have been hearing a lot of concerns from Black community, Latino community saying that they have a heightened concern about having people with authority have guns in their schools, right? Or in their malls, in places where they go. Why? Well, we know that that Black people are more likely than white people to be killed by law enforcement. We know from a study at the University of Colorado and at San Diego State that there is unconscious racial bias in split second decision making in terms of who is dangerous and who is not. In our culture, it is more commonly believed that an unarmed Black person is more dangerous than an unarmed white person, and a Black person with a gun is more likely to be shot than a white person with a gun. So, one of the things that was brought up was by teachers, by Black teachers, saying that we don't know if we really want to have a gun on us because if I hold a gun, it is more likely law enforcement may shoot me when they come in thinking that, mistaking who I am. And so these are just issues that as we look at this as a society, we can't just look at the mental health stuff. We have to look at the economics, the racial, the educational, because these are all things that until we start to sort of elevate everybody, we're going to continue to have these ripple effects in our society. And I guess that's our timer. Why don't I let you wrap us up?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's a little timer right there. Yeah, so obviously we don't have all the solutions. We recognize that not everybody is going to agree with everything they're saying. I'm sure there's things that we haven't thought of. The main point of this video is to continue a conversation in a healthy way where we're putting things out on the table. Hopefully other people too. Share this information. Let's continue the dialogue. These are kind of things, if you feel strongly about one thing or another, write to your legislators, write to your governors, write to different people, right? That could potentially move some of these things forward, because obviously the one thing that we're all fearful is going to happen that we can't let happen is nothing, because something has to be done. you know my goodness, look at how many this past week, in addition to the school shootings, how many other shootings that there are. Philadelphia, it is absolutely ridiculous, and if nobody does anything about it, nothing's going to stop. So, thank you everybody for joining us. Please leave any comments in the comments section below. Please, of course, join us on our social media platforms and engage with us. We really want to try to move this conversation forward. So, thank you everybody for listening, and have a great day.